Well, all right, Joe Crowley here, Yuba College history instructor. 17A, we're going to take a look at a little bit about the Revolutionary War, about economics a little bit, and the Enlightenment, and try and see how that all kind of is tied in. But we're also going to take a look at an incident in just before the war, actually 4 years before the war breaks out, before the Declaration of Independence. And no, it's not the Boston Massacre. It's something that actually happens in, of all places, Rhode Island. So let's take a look. I want you to look at this image, and I want you to think about what comes to mind. In 1968, Apollo 8 astronaut William Anders snapped this photograph as he commanded the module that began to orbit around the lunar surface. Apollo 8 never did land. It did orbit the moon, though. William Anders took this photograph as the Earth rose above the moon. Now, according to scholar Benjamin Lazier, this very famous Christmas photo, as it became known, as it was widely available to the general public by Christmas of 1968, had caused a great deal of anxiety, particularly among philosophers and other intelligentsia around the world. Lazier states that such photographs of Earth from a distance have not only become iconic, I mean, you can find them on tote bags, t-shirts, keychains, you know, all sorts of stuff. But these photos have also advanced humanity into a new era, a new conceptual framework. It literally shifted the way people began to think. We entered into what he terms the Earthrise era. So again, going back to the Benjamin Lazier thesis, he claims the way in which societies and societies throughout the globe have moved forward since the space race of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, it's been literally fraught with factions. And ironically, not unlike that of the numerous reactions nearly 500 years ago when Copernicus unleashed the mathematical formulas that proved the sun was at the center of the universe, not the Earth. Lazier states that this new Earthrise era is nothing short of radical and revolutionary. It's a new Copernicus revolution with eerily similar reactions as to what it meant for man, with a capital M, to be able to leave the planet at will, if not at great expense. Today, according to Benjamin Lazier, there are competing globalisms. There's commercial globalism and environmental globalism, and both at once are confrontational and polar, but both have worked in tandem to, and I quote, inadvertently accelerate our planetary emergencies as much as both factions attempt to slow it down. So we have these anxieties over gene splicing, over global warming, over continued genocide, and religious-inspired terrorism, the industrialization of agriculture. The list of Earth's problems are so huge and so apparently insurmountable, just almost like what happened after Sputnik launched in 1957. Just like, almost exactly like, what happened after Copernicus printed his On the Revolutions of Celestial Spheres way back in 1543. So why am I telling you all this? Mostly because historians firmly believe that Copernicus kicked off the Enlightenment era. The use of science, the use of mathematics, the firm belief in human rationality over superstition, and perhaps even religion. Copernicus used methodology, detailed observations of astronomical events to kick off something radically new. Folks, what I am telling you is this: the enlightened ideals that blossomed and peaked in the 18th and 19th centuries began in the 16th and 17th. They began as new ways and new methods to approach science. Gone were the old methods. Say goodbye to Aristotle. Say goodbye to the way science had been conducted for over 1,000 years. But they're called revolutions for a reason. You simply don't sweep aside tradition, religious or otherwise, with the mere word science. The Copernican revolution prompted a rather rigid conservative pushback, especially by the Catholic Church and other Christian sects, including and especially the Lutherans. But both Protestants and Catholics clung to a belief system that placed man at the center of God's creation. In fact, Lutherans rejected Copernicism, calling it an assault on, quote, the evidence of the senses, the 1,000-year consensus of men of science, and the authority of the Bible. In other words, Lutherans used in their argument against Copernicus the science that all of Western civilization had employed, the science that Western Christian religious leaders were comfortable with, the science that dated back to the time of Aristotle, which in the year 1549 was already 1,000 years old. Copernicus threatened the prevailing scientific theories since the time of Aristotle. But Copernicus unleashed excitement, and others that called themselves scientists continued to work on his theories, even though their work was considered heresy, and European leaders, both religious and secular, created an atmosphere that many historians can describe as anti-science. Johannes Kepler used the following mathematical observation that you see here to refine the ideals of Copernicus. The sun is at the center of the solar system, not the universe. And the planets do not orbit in perfect circles, but rather in ellipses. And further, Kepler raised the ante, so to speak, by referring to his observations and his formula as the law of planetary motions, to be exact. Science created laws to compete against God's law. Then came Galileo, with the publication of discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences in the year 1638. This is the publication that earned Galileo the title the Father of Physics. By using strict observations, some tall towers, some brand new timing mechanisms based on water, Galileo proved the law of falling bodies, that all objects, no matter their weight or mass, fall at the same rate in a perfect vacuum. Such disbelief at Galileo's findings caused an uproar not just among religious leaders — he was arrested for heresy — but among fellow scholars of this new science. However, Galileo's observations and writings were so detailed that they were easy to replicate, and soon the following formula was used to explain Galileo's observations. One of those that picked up on Galileo's writings and replicated his methods and experiments to his own astonishment was Isaac Newton. In 1687, Newton published his own findings that used math to write yet another law, gravity. And the formulas used by Newton not only correctly predicted lunar orbit and the coming and ebbing of tides, but of Halley's Comet and other non-planetary orbits, and with demanding precision. So powerful were the findings of science and scientists that other disciplines wholeheartedly took up the banner of science, or rather more correctly, the idea that through direct observation, acute hypothesis, and steadfast methodology, advances could be made. This is the true blossoming of the Enlightenment, when the scientific method becomes the foundation for a myriad of other disciplines. Other disciplines looking to advance knowledge, to advance humanity, to advance society. History, politics, economics, all embraced science and the scientific method. But perhaps more importantly, they picked up on the ideas of progress, of rationality, that this so-called Enlightenment could solve many of the world's problems. Little joke. I liked it. Thomas Hobbes, for example, will use Euclid's geometry to rationally and steadfastly argue that central governments should be strong, that we need a central leader and a strong king, as we see here on the cover of his most famous book, The Leviathan. Man needs government, according to Thomas Hobbes, and he used science and mathematics to make his argument in the book Leviathan. John Locke also used science. He based his second treatise on government on science, which was published in the year 1690. Rationality, optimism, progress, prescription, not prescription, but proscription for the future. That no longer should governments be based on the will of one person, the monarch, but rather the will of the people. This is called popular sovereignty, or the idea that the populace of the state consented to be governed by those that represented their interest. If those that govern do not, or no longer represent the interest of those that are governed, then the people have the right to remove the government and start anew. And thus it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who in 1762 published The Social Contract. Here it was, a radical idea put forward by a political scientist, that the rational observations show that governments are stable when the bond between the state and the governed are in concert. When the bond between the government and the governed are in cahoots. They are weakest when they are at odds. So Locke and Rousseau become justifications for the American Revolution, whose Declaration of Independence read that when any government infringes upon the rights of individuals, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. Now, the French Revolution went even further. It claimed that governments and the governed were not the only binding and unstated agreements to succumb to rationality and science, but that society, even culture, depended upon the common people. France outright rejected their existing society. They overthrew the king. They confiscated church property. They seized property belonging to nobles and aristocrats, and they systematically began to redistribute wealth to create a more equitable society and therefore a more stable society. It was only rational. Science and rationality would rule, not authoritarianism, not church-driven superstition. Well, another field that took up science was economics. And here it was, Scottish-based Adam Smith, who published Wealth of Nations in 1776, the very year the United States coincidentally declares its independence. Wealth of Nations used science to observe nature, to come to conclusions about economics. Recently, however, historians and economists have begun to pick apart the arguments put forth by Adam Smith. One of them is Frederick A. Johnson. In an article entitled Rival Ecologies of Global Commerce, Adam Smith and the Natural Historians, Johnson claims Adam Smith acted selectively in analyzing the data and arguments from contemporary natural historians. You see, back in the 18th century, the term natural history meant the study of resources. So, take the New World, for instance. Key word, new. Here it was, North America, South America, predominantly untouched, wild, natural. Natural history. Get it? Johnson says so too did Adam Smith. Adam Smith had a hobby, and his hobby was natural history. And he belonged not to one, but several natural history societies throughout all of Europe, from London all the way to Moscow and everywhere in between. But Smith was selective, at least according to Johnson. Smith ignored an enormous wing of natural history, a school of thought then known as cameralism. Cameralists, in fact, argued for state-directed projects to protect, develop, maintain resources, and in fact were appalled at the waste and misallocations of resources at the hands of colonial settlers and colonial governments. But Smith's attraction to natural history did not involve observations that concentrated on resources, such as native grasses, timber, fish stocks, mining ores, all that stuff. But Smith focused on how nature, if left alone, strikes its own balance. Now, this is true. If nature is left alone, it will strike a balance. But Smith ignored the fact that as soon as you bring in settlers, they invade the natural world, and in doing so, forever alter the balance of nature. And cameralists point this out. They insisted that Adam Smith's capitalism cannot mirror nature because, as the example in North America proved, settlers, or mankind's inherent qualities, were to abuse and exhaust natural resources almost immediately. According to the cameralists, if people insisted on disrupting natural order, then governments, likewise, must intervene to maximize natural resources for perpetuity. Further, Johnson, the historian, insisted that Adam Smith knew of the arguments put forth by these cameralists. He knew it. When Smith sat down to write Work of Nations, the Scottish philosopher simply ignored them. Smith instead developed the idea of an invisible hand. A market economy like that of nature, it would balance itself. Smith then could not tell you how nature struck a balance. He couldn't. But that was irrefutable. Something balanced nature, some invisible force. Thus, Smith chose optimism, just like the Enlightenment. Smith chose to believe a similar invisible force would balance the markets of a capitalistic economy. However, Johnson points out that the market is more like a farm than it is a wild jungle or a forest. Markets, just like farms, are man-made. Because they are man-made, they are unnatural, and because they are unnatural, they need care in order to remain viable. Something to remember in this current recession/depression. Lack of market oversights allowed the global financial structures to run amok in a very unnatural and globalized world. And so there we are again, the word global. And here it is, another NASA photograph, blue marble, snapped in the year 1972. Now, science has pushed us to this point. Observations, methodology, mathematics, all of it has allowed mankind to escape the gravity of being bound to the planet of their birth. And it is these pictures, these photographs, that once again, like the days of Copernicus, have caused a major stirring. It should be no surprise that science today is under attack. Scientists are being confronted on nearly every front. Just open up your newspapers or turn on your internet. Darwinism versus creationists. Global warming theory is debunked as myth. Science is told that it is wrong to seek medical cures from stem cells derived from embryos. I would argue that it is no surprise, and really not much different than it was nearly 500 years ago, after Copernicus pointed out that the Earth is not at the center of anything. But let's return to the topic at hand, to colonialists in North America, imagining a new state, a new country, imagining a new beginning, imagining that the British Parliament and the King, King George III, were no longer rational, no longer reasonable, but instead acted like the tyrants of old. It was time for colonialists to unite and shake off the shackles of Britain. Now, as we learned last week, there was plenty of unrest, plenty of rhetoric, plenty of tar and feathering of customs officials. I want to talk about a date before the Revolutionary War, June 9, 1972. Her Majesty's ship, the HMS Gatsby, gave chase to a small packet ship called the Hannah. Now, packet ships generally carry mail or official business from the Crown to royal governors. And for 2 months, the Gaspee attempted to carry out what it was ordered to do, to stem the tide of smuggling, something the colony of Rhode Island had become notorious for. And you can tell why when you look at this map. Rhode Island, its capital Providence at the very top. To get to it, you have to sail by, well, hundreds of islands. Some big, some small. It is a great place for smugglers to hide. But back to the 9th of June, 1772, the Gaspee is checking every ship, even official packet ships such as the Hannah, and had done so for about 2 months. The Gaspee gave a shot for the Hannah to stand to, but the Hannah suddenly pulled full sails, attempting to flee the scene. Now it's dark. It's near 2 in the morning, the smuggler's hour. And rounding a point near the small village of Warwick, the HMS Gatsby ran aground, right there on that mark. The captain of the Gaspee is young. He's brash. He's not even a full captain, but a lieutenant by the name of William Duddingston. And the local merchants did not like him very much, especially John Brown. John Brown is the brother of Nicholas Brown, who would go on to found Brown University, a very revered Ivy League school. The Browns, though, were smugglers, human traffickers, builders of slave ships, and they had become rather wealthy, breaking almost every known British law enacted by Parliament and the King. Duddingston took to seizing one of John Brown's sloops. Brown probably would not have minded this so much, for that is indeed what Duddingston was sent to do, but no one, not Brown nor even the British governor of Rhode Island, knew that Duddingston and the HMS Gatsby were in the bay. Duddingston had the nerve to seize the ship prior to reporting for duty. And to John Brown, this was not fair. Duddingston orders his men to free the ship that had run aground, his own. But it's no use. So the Gaspee sat and sat, waiting for high tide. But after a couple of hours, just a bit before dawn, several rowboats appear out of nowhere, and they are filled with armed men, many belonging to the local chapter of the Sons of Liberty. And they surround the HMS Gatsby, stuck in the mud near Warwick. There's a fight. It breaks out. Duddingston crew, though, the crew quits the fight early on. A shot rings out, and Duddingston is hit. All the crew and the wounded Duddingston are lifted from the ship and carried to shore. The HMS Gatsby is then lit afire, and the ship burned to the waterline. But this is not the end of the story. What gets real interesting is in the investigation of how a Navy warship owned by the British could be burned in 1772 by locals in Rhode Island. So an investigation ensues. Duddingston himself refuses to testify. I didn't think of it. A warship belonging to His Majesty was attacked and burned while under your command. What would you do? Duddingston wanted a court-martial, an attempt to clear his name, and he wanted it first before he would lend any witness to any investigation. And second, the initial testimony from some of Duddingston's crew claimed that the Gaspee raiders were, and I quote, men of credit and tradesmen, and but few like common men. In other words, their manner of dress led many to believe that the people who burned the Gaspee were bankers, import-exporters, and smugglers, just like the Browns. Another prominent Rhode Islander that day was Abraham Whipple, who, by the way, would become, during the Revolutionary War, one of America's first admirals. in charge of a new navy tasked with defeating a huge British onslaught of ships out at sea. Whipple's wife, though, at the time the Gaspee was burned, was Sarah Hopkins. Now, Sarah was a niece to Stephen Hopkins, who was then the British governor of Rhode Island. He's no slouch. Now, 3 days later, Rhode Islanders would vote to create their own navy. And 2 days after that, on the 15th of June, 1772, Whipple will attack a small British warship called the Diana. Whipple sailed on a ship called the Katy, a warship built by, well, you guessed it, John Brown. Now the British were down 2 Navy ships as the Katy defeated the Diana and towed the Diana back to Providence. The British frigate the Rose, commanded by James Wallace, sailed up the bay to Providence to investigate what happened to the Diana. But as he did so, the remaining 6 ships from his fleet were attacked by ships out of Newport. Wallace suspected Brown and Whipple, and he wrote a letter to Whipple in Providence. So from Wallace, the commander of the HMS Rose, to Abraham Whipple. You, Abraham Whipple, on the 10th of June, 1772, burned His Majesty's vessel, the Gaspee, and I will hang you at the yardarm. To which Whipple replied with equal brevity to Sir James Wallace, "Sir, always catch a man before you hang him." Third, not all of the so-called Gaspee raiders were white. In fact, the initial suspect in the shooting and wounding of Lieutenant Dunningston was Erin Briggs, an 18-year-old black man who was also an indentured servant. Though he admitted to rowing boats when he was interviewed, he denied shooting the lieutenant. But Erin Briggs also identified several of the raiders to British authorities. And when the British went to arrest Briggs's owner, since Briggs ID'd them as participants, the owners not only produced a lock-tight alibi, but they also claimed their servant, Briggs, was with them. Now, not to draw too much out of this, but it appears that the towns and surrounding areas, the men and the women who, after the fact, just simply refused to testify. They refused to give claim. They refused. The locals created ludicrous stories, wild stories, and the British could never ever identify or bring to justice any of the assailants. But, and this is the most important concept to take away, the British made legal motions to arrest and seize several prominent men from Providence, also from Newport and other Rhode Island villages, and put them aboard ships and take them to London, where they would be tried for treason. This is what attracted the attention of the House of Burgess in Virginia, and led to the appointment of committees of correspondence. And this led to the appointment of committees of correspondence not just in Virginia, but in almost every colony. The Gaspee Affair, ladies and gentlemen. In March of 1773, the Virginia House of Burgess appointed its own Committee of Correspondence and Enquiry, which consisted of 11 persons of very prominent names. And this committee was tasked to obtain the earliest information possible of the proceedings of the British Parliament and to keep up a correspondence with sister colonies. They were instructed without delay to inform themselves particularly of the principles and authority on which was constituted a court of inquiry, which was what the British wanted to do by extraditing the suspects in the burning of the HMS Gatsby. The March 1773 committee from Virginia was especially concerned about the development in Rhode Island and refused to concede that Britain held the power to transport persons accused of offenses committed in America to places beyond the seas to be tried. The Gaspee Affair, in short, worked to unify all the colonies. It opened up lines of communication between all the colonies, and all these colonies, ladies and gentlemen, had little in common other than the fact that they were beginning to really not like their mother country, Britain. There exists today a group calling itself the Descendants of the Gaspee Raiders, and there are several websites dedicated to the collection of information on these men who dared to take on the British Navy and win. We'll catch you next time.